What's up, Buttercups? My name is Caitlin Donald. I am an educator at the Dubuque Museum of Art, and this is the next video in the Art Adventures program. Last week, we talked about miniatures, and today we're going to talk about miniatures again. Except today is going to be a lot more of a casual video. Today I just want to focus on artists that use miniatures or kind of make miniatures for their own work. And so it's going to be a lot more of a casual video versus the very artsy, kind of artsy-fartsy video of last week. So this first artist is a Letha Chrome, and I'm probably going to pronounce a lot of the names incorrectly, but I'll get an A for effort. She knits tiny clothes, and some of her tiny clothes actually end up on the TV screen, which is kind of cool. So she's done costumes for a lot of stop motion animation videos and movies. She actually did the entire costume line for the movie Coraline, Neil Gaiman's Coraline. Which is cool. And this is a tiny, tiny, tiny Christmas sweater. And she knits using thread, which is really cool. So I'll go back to that other photo. So these are her knitting needles, and she's actually knitting with thread because it's so tiny. So this next artist is Thomas Doyle, and he's one of my favorites. Out of all the people we're going to talk about, he's one of my favorites. So this is Thomas Doyle, and I love his work because his work makes you feel really uneasy, and really like a feeling of almost dread to me. So you always kind of get a bit of a certain story where something has gone terribly wrong. For instance, here we have a house, right? And it's overgrown with all this vegetation. So why is that creepy? Well, this house used to belong to someone, right? What happened to those people? And so a lot of his stuff has it poses these kind of questions with no answers. For instance, we have this house, and somehow it ended up upside down. And clearly, you can see this woman here is concerned. This man is also concerned. I don't really know what the little girl is feeling, but clearly they're concerned about their upside down house. And we don't know how this happened. We don't know how to fix it. And so a lot of Thomas Doyle is these surreal, weird situations that aren't good. They're not great situations to be in. And what's really, really interesting to me is, remember in part 1, we learned that miniatures naturally make us feel really safe and in control. Well, I like that Thomas Doyle's work actually flips that around. So it uses miniatures to make you feel very not in control and to make you feel very not safe. You don't really know what will happen next. You don't really know what has happened. And the result is this really strange, kind of nervous feeling. This is another one of his works where this house is just gone. Well, part of the house is just gone. And so you kind of you connect with these little tiny people and their little tiny houses, and you don't really know what to do. You don't know how to kind of interact with these things, and I really like that about him. So this next artist, I assure you I won't pronounce his name right, but it's up here written down if you guys want to look him up later. This is a Russian artist, Salavat. Hopefully I pronounced it a little correctly. He carves pencil lead, and although he doesn't get into deep with meaning, so he doesn't really go into depth with meaning. For example, we've got like Darth Vader and Bart Simpson, and he kind of copies some stuff from popular culture. But he's very famous because he's carving pencil lead. And he's carving it in a way that has a crazy amount of detail. So let's see, we'll go on Big Ben. So these are famous buildings, and he's carving all these pencil tips. We have the Statue of Liberty. Here we have our pop culture. So we have Wall-E and Rango and Yoda, and we have a bunch of other people. But I do like the Darth Vader. I will admit, I like the Darth Vader. But this is, again, remember we talked about a lot of miniature artists aren't just praised for what their work is about, but the actual skill, the actual craftsmanship it takes to create the object they made. And I think he falls into that category, where people are very amazed at his ability to make these objects, but they don't really make you think, right? The subject matter, at least, doesn't really make you think, but it does kind of put you in this place of awe. This is a really cool place where you're like, dang, I can't carve that. It's so tiny. And these guys, you've probably also seen these guys all over the internet, and I really love them. So this is Christopher Beaufollet? Christopher Beaufollet. Again, anytime I mispronounce a name, I always try to write it somewhere on the screen so you guys can look it up later, pause the video or whatever. There's kind of this trend in photography to create tiny stories with tiny people, but using normal everyday objects. And it's really kind of cool. I like it because he uses these everyday objects to give us a feeling of everyday life for these tiny people. Like this person is just mowing the lawn. We all mow the lawn, you know, like we all do all this stuff. And so it kind of creates this little tiny world and you see yourself in this tiny little world. And I think that's really, really cool. So this is an actual screenshot from a trip to the moon. The first time that miniatures were used in film. You can kind of see they hand painted these clouds and they made this tiny rocket ship. It was originally in black and white, and then they actually hand colored the film later. This next one, so an abacus ring is basically like an old school calculator. They're usually pretty big, so they're usually like bigger than my tablet. But remember, we learned that miniatures are really important because they provide functional objects in a portable way. So this is a ring. So you're basically wearing a calculator on your hand. And it's about 300 years old, found in China. But again, it's that idea of something portable but is also functional. And this next one I would love to buy. So this one is a book from a company called Rock and Pebble. And it's a dollhouse book, which is really, really, really neat. Think about everything we've learned about dollhouses. So think about how in the early days they were these beautiful works of art. And I want you guys to think about, if you had this book, what would you put in your dollhouse? What would you draw in it? Would you draw these beautiful, expensive objects that kind of show how rich you are as a person? Just like the dollhouses in the 1600s. Would you draw a mystery, like the Francis Glessner Lee dollhouses? Or would you use your amazing brains and draw something completely different? So I like this because it takes a huge spin on the idea of the dollhouse, something that we've seen 1,000 times over and over again. And this is a completely different way to go about it. What I also really like is that you don't need to be wealthy or have a lot of supplies for this. All you really need is this book and a pencil, and you have a dollhouse. And I think that's really cool. I think that's really, really neat. This is another picture of it being used. I like this strange cat that's in the window and this duck that looks like he doesn't care about anything, and this cat is very intrigued on these like little wooden people. There doesn't seem to be a story here, but I feel like there's a story here. Like there's a little house with a clock. But anyway, you make your own, and it's all up to your own creative brains to fill up this book and create an environment, create something. And I really love that it allows that it allows you to be completely creative. And then this is Yosef Tari. And he owns the world's largest, smallest book collection, and I'm very jealous. He even has this, look at he has a tiny bookcase for his tiny books. I love it. Imagine being a monk and painting a picture in one of those tiny books. How small can you write and draw? I would, that's my challenge to you. Try writing a tiny book. So look at this. And some of these, a lot of his books are historical books. So they're actual things that were made hundreds of years ago. But look at this one. Could you imagine making a book that tiny? And could you imagine reading a book that tiny? I couldn't imagine reading a book that tiny. And I'm pretty young. I'm only about 30. My eyes are pretty good. But I don't know if I could read a book that's that small. And then this next artist is Victoria Richard. She does embroidery and creates these very small landscapes. And if you're from Dubuque or the Midwest at all, these landscapes are going to look super familiar because a lot of them are farmscapes. A lot of them are kind of countryscapes. And for being thread, just thread and needle, these come off as very realistic, which I think is a really cool way to make a miniature landscape, because they're not big. They're only they are actually probably life size, so they're only about like that big. You can fit in the palm of your hand. But you can almost feel like the heat of the summer when you're looking at them, and the land that she creates are really personal to her and important to her. So if you're looking at her work, what kind of lands are important to you? And then could you make a mini version of like your favorite hill or your favorite pond? I think that would be really cool. So this is Olafar, and he created a negative dollhouse. So it's kind of the opposite of that rock and pebble book where you draw inside the dollhouse. Now this is the one where you can draw maybe around the dollhouse. You can draw the landscape and the architecture. But it's really interesting. It's a negative dollhouse. And what you're actually looking at is nothing. So what you're actually looking at is the holes in the page that end up creating this house, which is a really fascinating way to do that. And also the layers of the book end up making it look like wooden planks to me, which is another way to kind of put in some realism, make it look a little bit real, which is really, really neat. And there's nothing but a bunch of holes and a bunch of space. And all together, these holes and the space build up and form a house. You can see rooms and windows and stairs and even like a door. You can kind of see it in this picture, but it's way back here. So you can even see a door. And it's so simple, but it builds such a complex picture. And I think that's really fascinating. That's really interesting. What kind of simple things can you guys do that will eventually build up to something really complex? If you had this book, what would you draw around the house? Would you put things in it? So would you put like tiny dolls and stuff in it? Or would you use it as a way to draw a background? So there's a lot of interesting questions we get from this stuff, from this artwork. So that's kind of it for this video. This is another Christopher Buffelli. I really love this one, especially since I work at the River Museum and I work with crawdads. But miniatures are always really interesting. Artists that use them are also a really unique breed. You look at things closer and in a small detail rather than try and overwhelm with size. And they often have a crazy amount of skill and steady hands, carefully making stories or saying something in a different way. It's so cool. It's cool to see the methods that people use miniatures in. I hope that you guys have kind of enjoyed this video. Again, it was super casual, just me kind of chatting to you about artists that I enjoy that use miniatures in a really fascinating way. I would love to see what you make. I hope you make stuff. I hope you're not just watching. I will see you guys next time on Art Adventures. And thank you again for being patient with me while I kind of learn how to develop my own style in making videos and what's working and what's not working, and experimenting and using the editing programs. So I wanted to say thanks for still watching and still hanging out with me while I'm learning and growing through this entire process, because it's been really, really fun to learn not only about the subject matters, but about how to present them to you guys in a cool way that's interesting and informative and questioning. And so I hope it's working. It seems like it's really fun. So I thank you guys for watching, and I hope that you have a lovely day. All right, peace out, guys.